My friend Rabbi Shraga Homnik has a habit to search up what's going on 100 years ago today, what's going on 100 years ago this week, and sometimes he comes up with intriguing stuff. So, last week he pointed out that the very earliest dated letter of the Rebbe that we have published is dated 100 years ago this week. So, the Rebbe's letters started being published in the mid-80s, where the Rebbe charged Rabbi Bar Levin, the librarian of the Chabad Library, with the mission of publishing his letters. And the very first letter in the set of Igros Kodesh is a letter dated in Tofresh Pei Ches in 1928, and it is addressed to the Rogachover Goin. Rogachover Goin, Rav Yosef Rosen of Dvinsk, very famous Goin. He's known as a Goin, which we translate as a genius, unusual, one of a kind, unique genius, a person who corresponded with Talmidei Chachamim throughout the world. He's known to have unusual or uncommon shittas in halacha. For the most part, we don't paskin like him, but he does have some very unique positions in halacha, and often it's influenced by, first of all, he doesn't really look very much, certainly not at the Achronim, and even the Rishonim, even the very earlier commentaries on the Gemara, other than the Rambam, he's not really interested in too many of them, and he kind of has his own way of paskening straight out of the Gemara, and he has a very, very deep way of analyzing the Gemara. What is the Gemara actually getting at, and getting to the core of it, and based on that, bring out halacha. And in Mitzvah Shem today we'll have a couple of examples of this. Be that as it may, they published, quote unquote, all the Rebbe's letters in 20 volumes, and then more and more stuff started coming out, so they started a series of miluim, of, how do you say in English, miluim? Supplements, things that belonged early on in the series, but they did not. So the first volume of Miluim is volume 21, and the very first letter in volume 21 is also a letter addressed to the Rogachover, and that one is dated from Yom Aleph Sunday, Tes Vav Tevis, the 15th of Tevis, that's coming up this week, Tov Reish Pei Hei, exactly 1925 to exactly 100 years ago. It's possible that year it was still December 1924, I didn't check up, but on the Yiddish date it was 100 years ago. And this letter, it's interesting that the signature on this letter is it's signed by Mordechai Gurari. And when they asked the Rebbe why is this letter signed Mordechai Gurari, it was because he was still in Russia, and they were cautious of the censor, whoever was monitoring the mail, that the name Schneerson shouldn't appear too much because that was a trigger, and so they used pen names. So Gurari the Rebbe was related. There was some cousin or relative or acquaintance of the Rebbe who had the name Gurari, and so that was the name that was used on this letter. Now, the bulk of the letter is actually a very in-depth discussion about certain of the halachas of treifas, and what renders an animal non-kosher. But then at the end, the very last paragraph of the letter reads as follows: But Michtavi HaKoidem, in my previous letter, so that we already know that there is an earlier letter from the Rebbe to the Rogachover earlier than this date, which to date has not been discovered or published. It's clear from a number of letters that the Rebbe throughout these years had an ongoing correspondence with the Rogachover. We only have a handful of those letters, I think 3 of them. I asked him, in my previous letter, can we suggest any source to the common practice of writing Beis Hey or Be'ezras Hashem on the top of a letter? Now, Be'ezras Hashem means with the help of God. Beis Hey could also mean Be'ezras Hashem. Perhaps when people write Beis Hey, what do they intend that to be an acronym for? Perhaps some people mean Be'ezras Hashem. I think it's common for people to think Baruch Hashem. I don't know that there's any substantial difference between the two. But basically the Rebbe is asking the Rogachover, I already asked you in my previous letter, is there any basis for can we find any source for this minhag of writing Beis Hey or B'Yezras Hashem on the top of the letter? Now, at this point, maybe it's interesting to pause and note that at this particular letter that we're reading now from Tafresh Pehei, the letter starts, as I said, Baruch Hashem Yom Aleph Tes Vav Tevis, right, with the Beis Hey, which again is usually it's understood to mean Baruch Hashem. But in the next letter from the Rebbe that we have published, which is the first letter in volume 1 of Igros Kodesh, which they reproduced on page 22 of volume 1. You can find this out. I made a couple of copies. On page 22 of the Mavi to the Igros volume 1, they've reproduced the actual facsimile of the handwritten letter, and you could see that on that letter there is no Beis Hey, which might surprise you, because as we'll see soon, the Rebbe was quite a big proponent of writing Beis Hey on the tops of letters and on the tops of all published works. But in this letter to the Rogatchover, dated in Pei Ches, it's very clear that there is no Beis Hey at the top of the letter. Right? So it's somewhat unusual, and we'll see soon perhaps why. So the Rebbe is saying to the Rogatchover, can we suggest a source? The truth is, says the Rebbe, that there's a little bit of a proof to the contrary, that one should not write Beis Hey on the top of the letter. Where is the proof the opposite? Rosh Hashanah Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis. On Rosh Hashanah Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis. What does it say in Rosh Hashanah Daf Yud Ches? Over Rashi Sham B'Kosh Yachil Levatel. So that refers to the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah. By the way, in the last class we also quoted from this same Amud of Gemara, where there we have the Machlokes of Rebbe Kiva and Reb Shimon, if the fast for Teves is supposed to be on the 10th of Teves or on the 5th of Teves. So later on in that same sugya, the Gemara is quoting from Megillas Tainis, and over there it says in Megillas Tainis, Betlasa B'Tishrei, on the 3rd of Tishrei, Batelis at Kartum in Shtarayo, it was nullified, mentioning Hashem's name on documents, because originally one of the decrees of the Malchus Yavan, of the what the Chazal refers to as the Greeks, as the Assyrians kingdom who made decrees against the Jewish people. One of the decrees was that you're not allowed to mention Hashem's name. So when the Chashmonai kings overcame the enemy, they instituted that you should mention Hashem's name even in mundane documents. And so they would write Shebishtas Kach V'Kach, and it's in this year, the Yochanan Kohen Gadol to Yochanan Kohen Gadol, the Keil Elyon, he is the Kohen. This is a paraphrase from the Pasuk, which in Lech Lecha, which describes Shem as being Kohen LeKeil Elyon, a Kohen, a priest to the to God. So here we're describing that the star is written in the year such and such to Yochanan Kohen Gadol LeKeil Elyon. Obviously they're writing Keil Aleph Lamed, not the way we would write it and pronounce it with a kuf. But then, so this was the Chashmonaim. They instituted this as a way of making Kiddush Hashem, but the sages did not agree with this. This person has a shtar, has a document that you owe me $100, and it says on the top Hashem's name. Tomorrow or in the future, you're going to pay me the $100. I'm going to give you the shtar. What are you going to do with it? You're going to discard of it. Hashem's name is going to be laying in the waste bin, a bitlum, and so they nullified this. And Rashi explains that this was a habit which had entrenched very deeply. People were always became very used to writing Hashem's name at the top of the shtar, and it took a lot of effort for the Chachamim to be able to uproot it. And therefore, on the date that it was successfully uprooted, exactly how you mentioned that date, I don't know, that was a date that was marked in Megillas Tainis. So the Rebbe says, from this letter it seems clear that we're not supposed to mention Hashem's name on a letter. So perhaps this is, okay, Beis Hey or Be'ezras Hashem, it's an acronym, it doesn't actually say Hashem's name like they were writing, but perhaps there's some proof from there that you should not be writing Hashem's name in a letter. The Rebbe's letter continues. Gam b'Sanhedrin Yud Aleph Amud Beis Mashma Kein. It's also appears this way from Sanhedrin Yud Aleph Amud Beis that you should not write Hashem's name. What's the connection to Sanhedrin Yud Aleph Amud Beis? So the Sanhedrin Yud Aleph Amud Beis is the only place in the Gemara in Chazal, I believe, that we have record of an entire letter. In other words, there's references to letters being written in Tanakh and in Chazal, and quotes from letters, but this seems to be the only place where we have a report of somebody wrote a letter, and this is what he wrote, and it gives you the exact verbatim quote of the letter from beginning to end, which is the letters, 3 letters that Rabbi Gamliel wrote to various communities, informing them of the status of the calendar, when they had made the dates, etc. And in those letters, there's no mention of God. It just starts off by saying straight away, La'achana to our brothers, B'nai Galilah from the Galu, from the upper Galilee, B'nai Galilah Ilah from the upper Galilee, Ola'achana B'nai Galilah Tatar from the lower Galilee, Shloim Chanyiski, you should have your peace should be great, etc. There's no mention of God. So again, here you have a record of Rabbi Gamliel writing a letter to communities with no mention of God at the beginning of it. Right? So this, says the Rebbe, is another source which would seem to indicate that you should not mention God in a letter. By the way, this is the Rabbi Hamdik who I started off with. He also quoted some academic article who's going through all different ancient letters that we have in whatever context he's going through them. But I did peruse that article, and it does seem that indeed from all the ancient letters that we have from the Second Temple period and whatever, that all the letters start off with, from where it's going to where it's going, but there's no mention of God in any of those letters. Okay? What is the exception? The Rebbe continues on. Don't bring me a proof from Sanhedrin Tzaddik Vav Amud Aleph that you should write you should write Hashem at the top of the letter. What is the raya from Tzaddik Vav Amud Aleph? Sanhedrin Tzaddik Vav Amud Aleph. So there is a story of the reward of Nebuchadnezzar. I'll read to you the Gemara from the Art Scroll. Some of it I'll read in the Gemara, some of it I'll translate. Choloi from the Gemara reads like this. The incident of the 4 steps that Nebuchadnezzar was rewarded for, what is it? The Chesiv Ba'isahi, the Pasuk says, Shalach Meredich Baladon ben Baladon Melech Bavel Sfarim. The king of Bavel, so this is whose name is Meredach Baladon, he sends letters. Sfarim in this context means letters. He sends them to the king of Eretz Yisrael by the name of Chizkiyahu HaMelech. Mishum kichad Chizkiyahu v'yachzak shadalei sfarma mincha. Chizkiyahu was deathly ill. You may be familiar with the story that he was going to die, and the prophet told him that even his prayers won't help. Anyway, then his prayers do help. He tells the prophet that I have a tradition from my father's house that it's never too late for the prayers to help. And so he sends, so Chizkiyahu recovers, so the king of the neighboring land of Bavel sends a letter from one head of state to another congratulating him on his recovery. So how does the letter read? There was a whole miracle that happened with the sun, the daylight hours changing. So anyway, the letter reads like this. Shalom Malka Chizkiah, greetings to King Chizkiah. Shalom Lekar to Yerushalayim, greetings to the city of Yerushalayim. Shalom Le'Lehar Rabba, greetings to the great God. Okay, now, Nebuchadnezzar suffered the Baladon Hava. Nebuchadnezzar was at this stage in his career, was the secretary or the scribe of Baladon. When this particular letter was written, he was not there. Also, when he came back, he asked his staff, how did you write this letter? So they said to him, and this is what we wrote, and they repeated to him what they wrote. Nebuchadnezzar said to these people, you referred to Hashem as the great God, and you wrote him at the end. First you say peace to you, then you say peace to Jerusalem, and then you say peace to the great God. God belongs at the first, he should be the first on the list. This is how you should write the letter. Shalom le'al Rabba, and then afterwards you should write Shalom le'kartu Yerushalayim, Shalom le'malka Chizkiah, etc. So they said to him, and this is a very famous quote from the Gemara. You've all heard it before. Karaina the Iglis Peranka. You're the one with this genius idea. You have to be the one to carry it out. And so Ra'at Basrei, Nebuchadnezzar chased the courier service who was carrying the letter, and he brought it back and he rewrote it, putting the name of Hashem first. So the Rebbe says, okay, so you see here that they wrote the Hashem's name in the letter, but don't bring me a proof from there that that's a good idea to write Hashem's name in the letter. That's no proof. Now the Rebbe doesn't say why it's not a proof, but my understanding perhaps is that the reason it's not a proof is because this is a letter from a head of state to a head of state. It's, whatever the category, the genre of that letter is, that doesn't mean that when one Jew writes from a goy, he's trying to be respectful to your state, to your you represent God, you're the king of God, and the king, we spoke about this in the past also, how the king represents God. That doesn't mean that you're supposed to write Hashem's name in every mundane letter and document that you write.
And all the letters end up in the presidential library.
Right, exactly. Presidential letters don't get discarded so quickly. We'll see more of that. Then the Rebbe says also, don't bring me a proof from Chulin Sadik Hamid base. Don't bring me a proof from there. Also, we're not going to learn that Gemara inside. I think the reason why the Rebbe is saying don't bring me a proof from Chulin Sadik Hamid base is because over there the Gemara only records a segment of the letter, so there's no proof one way or the other of whether or not it said Hashem's name at the top of the letter. And then the Rebbe adds, and all the nuschais of shtaris that we have, loy nimtza kain. There's no record of writing Hashem's name at the top of shtaris. I'm not sure exactly what the Rebbe is referring to, if perhaps he's referring to letters that had been found in archives or whatever. Obviously nowadays we have, in the last 100 years, the amount of documents that have been revealed from the Cairo Geniza and other places like that. Of course, we have a lot more to work with. But the Rebbe, again, I assume the Rebbe is saying we're not aware of any old documents that have been revealed that have Hashem's name on it. Anyway, then the Rebbe quotes another Gemara in Yavam Sadik Vav. I'm not sure what the Rebbe is trying to bring from that Gemara, so we'll leave that for now. And the Rebbe finishes off with it's a wondrous sort of, how come I wrote this to you already in my previous letter, and I don't understand why you didn't address this in your response. Now, the truth is that till today, we don't know if the Rogatchover ever responded to this particular point of the Rebbe's letter. However, there is a published tshuva of the Rogatchover which talks exactly about this point, which we'll get to right now. And that is printed in the tshuvas of the Rogatchover, Siman Kuf Tzadik Vav and Kuf Tzadik Zayin. Siman Kuf Tzadik Vav is a letter dated from the Rogatchover, dated Chof Beis Kislev Tov Reish Tzadik Daled, so that's 9 years after this correspondence with the Rebbe, and it's addressed to an individual by the name of Moshe Reinhold in the city of Kashoy. I didn't have a chance to look him up, and the question that this Rabbi Reinhold posed to the Rogatchover, and by the way, it's in Dvinsk, so at this point, the Rogatchover is already back in Dvinsk. Now, just a little bit of history without getting into details, you can see why the Rebbe, the letter from the Rebbe in Tafresh Peches, I believe, is addressed to Leningrad, which is Petersburg, I think. But where's this letter addressed to? Not sure if it says where. But B'cholif, the point is that around the time of the First World War, the Rogatchover left Dvinsk and he spent some time in Leningrad, etc. But by this point, in Tafresh Tzadik Dalet, which is 1930, Kislev Tzadik Dalet is 1933, the Rogatchover was already back in Dvinsk. And he's addressing the letter to this Rabbi Moshe Reinhold, and the question that Rabbi Reinhold posed to the Rogatchover was, Madua in the case of Rabbi going Tevis Beis Hey B'Rosh HaMechtovim. Why do you, the Rogatchover, not write Beis Hey at the tops of your letters? So the Rogatchover writes them briefly like this. There's a lot to elaborate on this. In cause of Ois Achas Ben Hashem, if a person writes one letter of Hashem's name, in Mutal Mechoik, are you allowed to erase it? Right? We're all familiar. There's a prohibition. One of the 613 mitzvahs in the Torah is that you're not allowed to erase Hashem's name. So what if you just write one letter of Hashem's name? Hashem's name is Yud Kei Vav Kei. What if you just write the Yud? Are you allowed to erase the Yud? Says the Rogatchover, that's a great sugya, a big sugya, Ayin Yerushalmi, and a number of sources about this. And then he finishes off after the sources. He says, therefore one must be careful not to write Beis Hey al Rosh HaMechtovim on the heads of letters. So Rabbi Rosen, the Rogatchover, was of the opinion that the Hey of Beis Hey was actually one of the letters of Hashem's name, and therefore it is subject to the prohibition of not erasing or treating with disrespect Hashem's name, and therefore it should not be written. In the following letter, which is written on Gimel Elul Tov Reish Tzadik Hey, which is about 18 months after the previous letter, but it's printed next in the book, addressed to the very same person. And over here, it goes into another whole thing, a whole bringing sources, etc., for the idea of whether one letter has significance or not, but clearly, and here's an example of how you see the Rogatchover, he's not looking so much at the Rishonim, etc., he's just going straight in the Gemara and trying to deduce from statements throughout Shas whether one letter has significance, and because the Rogatchover is convinced that one letter has significance, therefore he assumes that Beis Hey, that the Hey of Beis Hey actually counts as being one of the letters of Hashem's name, and therefore you're not allowed to erase it, and therefore do not write it on letters. So I think you see a bit of an example of the Rogatchover's approach to how to pass Shilas, and we'll see more on that in a moment.
He might not have done anything, but
we'll see soon.
Isn't that actually considered a hay that you're referring to Hashem?
Oh, very good. We're going to get to that. But it's just interesting to point out that the Rebbe, even though the Rebbe had quite a strong opinion about writing Beis Hey, and the Rebbe often encouraged people that said you must write Beis Hey, and there's a Sikha in the Sichas in Purim, Chelek Vav, where the Rebbe writes about how it's eingefried b'chol tfutzis Yisrael. It's a very common practice for people to write Beis Hey on the top of a letter, even when the content of the letter is mundane matters, and there's numerous stories, correspondence with the Rebbe, with people. The Rebbe was always telling people to do this, but it seems that in deference to the Rogatchover's opinion, at least in this letter in Tafish Peches, the Rebbe did not write Beis Hey on top of the letter that was addressed to the Rogatchover himself. That's what it appears. Now, somewhat ironically, in the book Migdal Oz was a book printed and published by Rebbe Shua Munshein, wherein he has all sorts of interesting documents that pertain to Chabad history, and over here in page 100 of Migdal Oz, he reproduces 8 letters written by the Rogatchover, all addressed to the Rebbe Rashab, it seems. Yeah. So I think so. I didn't look at all them. But these letters do in fact have Beis Hey. The Rogatchover himself put Beis Hey on top of these letters to the Rebbe Rashab. So the way these... So Rabbi Munshein has his notes over here on the letter, and he says that the Beis Hey on these letters were not written by the Rogatchover; they were part of the letterhead. And elsewhere in the Rogatchover's Shuvas, he quotes a Shut Shalmus Yosef Simcha Beis. I did not have a chance to look it up, but over there, the Rogatchover seems to be of the opinion that there is no kedusha, there's no sanctity to printed words. Right. So again, here you have an opinion of the Rogatchover which is different than standard practice. We all consider, none of us would throw out or disregard the printed name of Hashem or anything like that. But again, the Rogatchover toes his own line, and the Rogatchover seemed to be of the opinion that a printed word doesn't have sanctity. And so Rabbi Munshein is suggesting that even though the Rogatchover was of the opinion that you should not write Beis Hey at the top of your letter, but he may not have had an issue with printing Beis Hey on his letterhead. Now,
why?
Why what?
Why would he not have an issue with prints?
Because he was what Rabbi Munshein is suggesting is it's because the objection to writing Beis Hey was because the Hey he considers the Hey to be a letter of Hashem's name which you're not allowed to treat disrespectfully, and the Rogatchover is of the opinion that a printed letter has no sanctity, only a written letter does.
Oh, so from printing press. Right.
So because it was on his letterhead, therefore it was okay. It was a printed letterhead. Again, that's Rabbi Munshein's suggestion. You can take it or leave it. But right now,
so he'd be fine throwing out this Gemara.
I don't know. No, it also doesn't mean that. Okay, I face it. It's all suggestions. Okay, I mean, Rabbi Matisov suggests that maybe he was writing a letter to the Rebbe, so it was
like the president
to the Rebbe. But if he had such printed letterhead, I assume he used that letterhead for other things as well. So who knows exactly what the pshat is? Now, there is a book we've read from this book before in the context of Bar Mitzvah, we gave a class for your son. How old is he turning? Is he
14.
He's 14. So over a year ago, we had a class in honor of Benzi Marinelli's Hanachas Tefillin, where we spoke about the minhag that pretty much most of Klal Yisrael does today, that you don't start wearing tefillin until either your bar mitzvah or very shortly before your bar mitzvah. But all other mitzvahs you start doing as soon as you're old enough to do. But tefillin we only start at the bar mitzvah or a month or 2 months or 3 months before, but not more than that for the most part, right? So in that context, we read a section from Rabbi Kafach's writing. Rabbi Kafach, he has a lot of writings, and he has 3 volumes called Ksavim of essays, the articles that he wrote. And one of the articles in that book was bashing. So, I mean, essentially, Rabbi Kapach's message in all of these essays is that Yemenite Judaism is the authentic way to do things, and all you guys, Sephardim, Ashkenazim, and everything in between, you've all got it wrong. So, this idea that you wait until that you make a big celebration of the Bar Mitzvah, and there's all these 10, 11, 12-year-olds who are perfectly capable of not wearing tefillin, and there's no heter for this, it's explicit in Chazal, that when the child is old enough to put on tefillin, he has to do so, etc., etc. Anyway, so that was it. So, in the same book, he also has an article about writing the Ezras Hashem on the tops of letters. And he says this is a new minhag which developed in the last few centuries in Europe. And, but, in the authentic way of doing things in Yemen, this never became the minhag. And in Yemen, the minhag is to start letters with the acronym Lamed Kuf Yud. Lamed Kuf Yud stands for a pasuk in last week's Sedra, which we just read yesterday. Lishuascha kivisi Hashem, and hope for your salvation, Hashem. So that's a good way to start a letter. But Beisei Baruch Hashem, that's like a new thing. There's no basis for this. And he goes on to say, it's not so bad, but it's certainly not authentic, and the way we do it is the best way. Anyway, that's Rabbi Kafach taking it. Now we'll do questions in a moment, if that's okay. In addition, the way the Rebbe wrote it in that letter, to write Beis Hey or Be'ezras Hashem, and I think that in Chabad, it's pretty common that people write Beis Hey. I think that it's also much more common, certainly outside of Chabad, for people to write Beis Samach Dalet. Beis Samach Dalet stands for B'siyata D'Shmaya, with the assistance of heaven. Now, what is the virtue? I don't think that there's any sort of why Chabad do that and others do that. I don't know that there's any strong reason for it. You could say that the virtue or the advantage in writing Beis Samach Dalet over writing Beis Hey is that even if you want to say, like the Rogatchover says, that the Hey of Beis Hey is like the Hey of Hashem's name, and therefore you can't write it, if you write Beis Samach Dalet, you don't have that issue at all. So perhaps that's why some people prefer to write Beis Samach Dalet, and perhaps you could say that the contrary, the reason why in Chabad we write Beis Hey is because the Rebbe was clearly of the opinion that Beis Hey is not a problem, and despite the Rebbe himself raising the objection from the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, like we saw, but nevertheless the Rebbe was clearly of the opinion that it's not a problem, and so we're comfortable to rely on our Rebbe's psak that Beis Hey is not a problem, and we don't need to resort to writing Beis Samach Dalet. But again, this is all just the icing on the cake. L'guf shel davar, whether you write Beis Hey or Beis Samach Dalet, they're both good, and they're both in fulfillment of the general idea here, which, like the Rebbe says in L'Kutei Sichos Chelik Vav that we quoted before, that the idea is Shem Shomayim Shogar Apiv, to make sure that you're always cognizant and mentioning of Hashem's name. A couple more sources over here. I'll tell you about Beis Samach Dalet, B'siyata D'Shmaya, and writing it on letters. The term Siyato Min Shemaya appears in the Gemara, which is famous in Chabad, because it's the Gemara in Megillah, which reads, Yogati v'lo matzasi al tamin, lo yogati matzasi al tamin, yogati matzasi tamin. Everybody knows that. We call it a pasuk, It's the Rebbe said the psukim u'mamari chazal, but they just became known in short as the 12 psukim. And in the continuation, the next line of that Gemara, the Gemara says, when do we say that if you're gaiti, that if you work hard, you're for sure going to succeed? When it comes to studying Torah, with worldly matters, siyatahu min shemaya, it all depends on whether, we might say in today's language, it's bashert or not. So that's the sort of the source of the term B'siyata D'Shmaya, and that became known. B'siyata D'Shmaya became a common way of talking, and it became common to put it on the tops of letters. He brings here a tshuva from Rav Moshe Feinstein, who writes that that whether or not you could write Beis Hey on the top of the letter, and I've heard that there are those who claim that it's a problem because it's Hashem's name. Says Rav Moshe, I don't see any problem with this. He says, Shalom Matsui. It's not common that people should erase it. In other words, even if you want to say that it is the Hey Hashem, it's not common. In our region, it's not common at all that they should use paper that was used for a letter for cleaning oneself after using the facilities. Because now affluent times, we have toilet paper. There's no concern about that happening. And then he says, however, he finishes off, to make an emphasis that you must write Beis Hey on the top of the letter. That Rav Moshe is not. He says, I don't see any basis for that. How could you say that you must do something for which there is no basis or in Chazal to do such a thing? B'chol Rav Moshe Feinstein does remain in the popular opinion, and the Rogatchover is somewhat, we could call it the Das Yachid. All the other poskim we talk about this are of the opinion that the Hey of Baruch Hashem is not an issue of treating it with disrespect or erasing it because it doesn't stand for one of the letters of Yud Kei Vav Kei, but rather, like Akiva said, it stands for the Hey of Hashem, which means the name, which is in and of itself kind of an idiom of sorts in order to avoid saying Hashem's name.
Is that why some books say instead of a Hey they write a Dalet? Is that suggesting, you know what I mean? You'll see books that...
There are, some people write, sometimes in Shuvah you'll have this a lot, that instead of writing Hey, they write Dalet. Why they write Dalet instead of Hey, I don't know.
Because of this, I don't know.
Could be, I don't know. There's a whole history of how people wrote Hashem's name over the years, even in Sidurim. In our Sidurim, it's common to have two Yuds. There were in old Sfarim it has three Yuds, and there are places where it has, I think, a Yud and a Nun. There's all sorts of different ways of how Hashem's name was referred to and alluded to. Now, the truth is that I want to. There's another place where this is relevant because we're talking here about writing this in mundane and letters and everyday papers that go into waste. What about in books? So obviously the two are not comparable because you could, even if you're against writing Beis Hey on a letter, you could say it's still a good idea to write Beis Hey on a sefer because that's something that's prominent and that's actually holy and going to be treated with holiness, etc. But what does come to mind is the Rambam, who at the beginning of every sefer writes B'Shem Hashem Keil Olam. Where is the source for B'Shem Hashem Keil Olam? It's a pasuk in Parshas Vayera, I believe, where Avraham Avinu says, "Vayita Eshel b'Veir Shava." He planted an Eshel. Some say Eshel means a vineyard. Some say it means a hotel. But he made a place in Veir Shava. Vayikra Sham b'Shem Hashem Keil Olam. He called there in the name of Hashem, the God of the world. And we're all familiar with the way this is explained in the Basi Lagani Maimarim. It's coming up within a month of Yud Shvat. Al Tikra Vayikra Vayakri, that he didn't just call in Hashem's name, he taught and inspired other people to call out in Hashem's name. So the Rambam, being a tremendous fan and student of Avraham Avinu, and naming his son after Avraham Avinu, we spoke about that a few weeks ago. The Rambam, and by the way, the name Avraham was not very common in the time of the Gemara. Some say that there's no one in the Gemara by the name of Avraham. Others say that no, that all the Avraham whose name was Abba, really the name was Avraham. So we're not getting into that now. But b'chol ofen, it's clear that the Rambam saw very much as saw himself very much as the one sort of to be carrying the flag, the banner of Avraham Avinu. So it kind of resonates that he would begin every work, every sefer of his, every one of the 14 Sfarim of the Rambam with the pasuk B'Shem Hashem Keil Olam, in the name of God, King of the world. There is an individual who lives in Eilat by the name of Rabbi Swissa. I know him somewhat. We're in touch a little bit on WhatsApp, and he recently made a wedding. He married off one of his children, and he published for the wedding an entire book. I think it's over 100 pages, going through all the psukim that the Rambam brings at the beginning of every sefer. At the beginning of every sefer, there's B'Shem Hashem Keil Olam, followed by a pasuk. Every one of the 14 Sfarim has a pasuk or a couple of psukim before it, and he goes through what does this pasuk mean and what's the connection to that sefer, etc., very in depth. But he has over there a little write-up on a number of pages on this introduction of B'Shem Hashem Keil Olam, Where does it come from? What's it all about? And he points out that, and I don't think this is his own chiddush, I think this has been stated before, that the Rambam lives in a Muslim environment. And in Islam, it is common that before you say anything, or before you do anything of significance, you say Bisam, excuse my Arabic pronunciation here, Bismillah Rahman V'Rahim, which Rabbi Suisa translates for me as B'Shem Hakel HaRachaman V'Harachim, in the name of God, the merciful and compassionate one. So that was common talk in Islam, and he says it stands to reason that the Rambam, who's writing a holy sefer for Jews in an Islamic society, would want to sort of use something that's familiar to them and to use it out in a way of actually reminding people about Torah and God, etc. So he takes this pasuk that Avraham Avinu says, "B'Shem Hashem Ke'Lelam," which kind of matches and resonates a little bit with the Islamic equivalent of it, and he therefore puts B'Shem Hashem Ke'Lelam in the beginning of every sefer. This is an interesting summary and in honor of 100 years of this letter being written. But the takeaway, the bottom line is clearly that according to the Rebbe, this is something the Rebbe encouraged very much, that we should make sure that Shem Shamayim should be Shagra al Piv, that a Yid, wherever he goes and whatever he does, and Kol Masecha Yil Shem Shamayim, that even in the most mundane things that you might be writing, you always start off with Baruch Hashem, Be'ezus Hashem, etc., to remember that to be nothing could remain void of Hashem, and Hashem should be included in everything that we do.
Okay.
Did you ever hear that Christopher Columbus